go ahead and start live stream, which I wasn't before. So and to start off, I'd love to hear a little bit about, Anney, from you. What is flat pack? Just kind of materially, what would be the one sentence description of what flat pack is?
Flat pack is text and collage poetry, image and poetry. And it's words that are cut from a couple different translations of Marcus Aurelius. And all the images are sort of fused together from different flat pack table instruction manuals, assembly manuals, mostly from, actually all from IKEA, for a couple reasons. And it's all came from Zadie Smith's book of essays, Intimations. In her introduction, she describes the beginning of the pandemic and being in this moment of crisis, and she read Meditations as if it were an instruction manual, and she actually said a flat pack table instruction manual. So I read that and I thought it was interesting, and then I revisited it when I was going to teach the essay, and then I thought, well, what if I just use that as a prompt? Like, it would just be fun to like make that a prompt. Come up with, and that was flat pack. And I thought it was just going to be for like a little, send it off to a journal and just have fun. And then it just seemed so topical and it was so much fun to make that I thought I'm just going to make it a little chapbook. Yeah, and a chapbook is just a word for a very short book of poems, or sometimes essays. It's not related to chapstick. Chapbook. Okay. Yeah, chapbook. Yeah. So sometimes I just say book, but it's very short. You can like read it in one sitting, which is nice because then I don't feel bad about like hawking it onto my friends and family because it's not taking up too much of their time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, Karl, you have had the opportunity over the course of your artistic life to integrate words a lot into your visual art. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that and what that kind of means to you?
So it is something I did a lot in earlier work. I did work that was more journalistic and more confessional, and more overt in a lot of ways. And I did like exploring how text and art can serve as a they can complement each other in the same space. I'm interested in telling narratives, but recently I don't use text for that. I'm interested in telling narratives solely with pictures. So yeah. Yeah, I'm interested to understand more of the significance of why you're pairing these flat pack images with the specific poem, and yeah, what they mean to you personally, because we as viewers obviously take something different from looking at the book. And I'll be honest, I've never read Marcus Aurelius. Like, I don't have that context. So is it intended to be approachable for someone who doesn't have that context, or
so I actually hadn't read Marcus Aurelius before the book, and I'm not like a classicist, and I don't know a lot about him. And it wasn't really until after I finished the project that I started reading up on like the history of Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius. And even now I wouldn't call myself even close to an expert. But one thing that was really, I gave myself permission because Zadie Smith describes that specifically that she was reading his work for the first time. And so I was trying to simulate that basically. Like I was trying to simulate the experience of reading this ancient text of a crisis, to see instruction manuals in it.
Mhm.
So so it is supposed to be accessible for someone who doesn't know anything about Aurelius or his meditations. But they are lovely. I mean, I think they're worth reading for sure on their own. But it's more about the language of instruction and like almost, I guess, advice, but even just like direction, like
Mhm.
looking at something and trying to get direction. And I think what I was thinking a lot about while I was doing this was like, how does it feel? Like, yeah, like how did that beginning of the pandemic really feel? Like we didn't really know anything. Like we had no instructions. And when we got instructions, they were like completely reversed the following week, you know? So I was thinking about that as I wrote. So I think, yeah, like it's supposed to be accessible for anyone. Just it's, and I think it's sort of like absurd and visually appealing. Maybe I should read a little from
I
it
like,
before
yeah, I
we
like
end.
the Zadie Smith quote. That was it. I just had a brief chance to look at it when I first
Yeah.
came in. I didn't get the text beforehand, although I read the essay linked on your Instagram.
Oh,
So to try and get some context for what
thank
the
you.
what the chap is. Yeah, I liked what Zadie Smith was saying, that she was reading it purely as an instructional, and I was having no idea what the text is really about. I was like, what does she mean by that? She's using it as a reference for her own work or the specific period in time that we're, like you say, in the context of the pandemic.
Yeah. You mean what does Zadie Smith mean?
That's what I'm wondering. Yeah.
Yeah. I think she really meant it in the context of the pandemic.
Mm.
Yeah. And a lot of it is, it's about like perspective. A lot of the meditations are about perspective and like thinking about how small you are compared to everything, and being compassionate towards people and working together. So thinking about that. Yeah, like I think that's what she was looking for. And I don't know if she found it either. Like you look at the rest of the essays and it's about being conflicted and feeling like, you know, she's not sure if she was making the right choices, and she's writing about like Donald Trump. And so, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's thank you for expanding on that. And it seems like you connected with the text in a similar way. I mean, it inspired you to branch out your medium, because have you worked with images like this before?
I really, not really actually. So I have since, because like that essay was about hand imagery and technical illustrations, and also about, it was about instructions about how to not get hurt, starting with Kafka's earlier technical writings about wood planing machines.
I had no idea about that. I was like, what is this talking about? Kafka did wood planing?
I know. He worked for an insurance. It had something to do with insurance.
Okay.
Yeah. And I only know this because of Kate Zambrino, who everyone should read. Jake still has my copy of her, which is the Kafka essay. Yeah.
So he wrote like a technical manual about avoiding injury in that.
Well, that's what I thought it was, and that's what I wanted the essay to be. But then when I read it, it was really about like, here's how your business will save money if people don't cut off their fingers. So it was like the economic appeal of not. So it wasn't an instruction manual, which was disappointing, but there were some really graphic images.
No, you could see that kind of brutality being an influence on his work. I mean, definitely someone that had experience with.
Yeah, and this was, I think, like the year before he wrote In the Penal Colonies, which was about a torture machine. So, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So I guess, and since so I have been more interested in technical illustrations and the idea of instructions. Yeah. But I think prior to Flat Pack, I'm looking at Jen because we went to grad school together, and I don't think I didn't do a lot of image, a little bit of collage, like for zines and stuff. Yeah, so I would do like collage for zines. And you're a collagist too.
I do, yeah. I don't have any work to reference, but I've been doing a lot of collage in the pandemic. my grandmother passed and I inherited all these materials from her. She was an English teacher all her life, and I got her yearbooks. She had years of journals. She journaled all her life, and no one else in the family really, I mean, a few people wanted to keep those things, but I wanted to keep everything. And for me, it was so easy to attach meaning to everything. And I want to collage with these old yearbooks from the 60s, and even opening them up and looking at the way students talked about themselves at that time. Like, oh, this is really fascinating. And yeah, so yeah, that's true. This year I have found a new interest in incorporating text in that way.
And earlier you talked about narrative in your work. Do you find that you're creating narrative with those collages?
Yeah, I think maybe you could tell from listening to me, it's a lot easier for me visually to assemble ideas than through words.
Yeah.
But appropriating text from like my grandmother and her collections to me into my artwork, where visual art comes more naturally to me, it's kind of in a way doing the opposite of what you're doing, where you're sourcing images to the text that you are familiar with.
Yeah.
And I've been doing work lately where I'm seeking out words or phrases that I can connect with a piece and help frame a series of pieces into a narrative. For me, because doing original writing doesn't come so naturally.
Yeah.
So each of you work in different mediums, as you were just discussing, but I think each of your works also are really, at least in the case of Flatpak, have not seen much of your other work, but work specifically with breaking some of the traditional forms of the genre that you're working with. For example, a traditional poem with stanzas and rhyme and meter and a pretty straight line structure, or creating artwork, for example, Karl, that is not just a visual representation of an idea, but also tells a story and has that narrative element. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that form and what it kind of means to you to break those traditions with the work that you're putting out?
Yeah. Well, for me, my degree is actually in fiction, and I mostly publish essay, and I actually feel like an essayist. Yes, and so I think So I think maybe that helped me approach, and I didn't even approach Flatpak as poems. It was more like poem was the best way to describe what I was doing. Yeah. And I think that, and I also like, I was really inspired by like Sarah Sloat, who actually blurbed the book, which was really sweet of her. She has a book of erasures called Hotel Almighty, of a Stephen King novel. Erasures of Stephen King's Misery. And hers is like really visual. And I was kind of inspired by that. And I have seen, I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head, but there does exist, like, and I studied in grad school, like we took, Andrew's back there from grad school, we took a class called Book Beast, where it was like just expanding. It was like the most outrageous thing you could think of. And then just, like we just, basically we were exploring, in a sense, we were exploring a lot of extremes. So I remember once someone wrote a poem, caught it on fire, put the ashes in a jar, filled the jar with water, and then shook it up until it was like sludge and turned that in. And the professor liked it so much, she saved it and showed it to every next class. So it was sort of like when that's like on one end, like this didn't actually feel like too much of a genre break. It was like, it's still words that you can read. And in most of them, I think there's only one order or maybe two, but not that many more than two. Yeah, yeah. And it also really felt to like, it was just like the exercise was like a prompt. It was like, this Zadie Smith is describing this thing and I am going to try to make it. Yeah.
What was she describing?
Well, she was describing reading Elias as if it were instructions for a flat pack table. And I was like trying to imagine what that would look like. Like, what would it look like to have a flat pack table instruction manual that is actually about surviving a pandemic on a spiritual level, and incorporating Marcus Aurelius.
Okay.
Yeah, like almost like just literal, like she was like talking about it like figuratively, and I was trying to make it literal.
What is it about the Marcus Aurelius text that applies so well in that way?
Well, I mean, I think her suggestion that it's instructions, is very, is how a lot of people read it. It's literally like, it's all like in the imperative. It's like, do not do this, do this. When this happens, think about this. So in that way, it is a lot like instructions.
On a philosophical level, being transposed against images that are very material, and yeah, that's interesting. Trying to remember Shady's prompt, but the thoughts it brought up for me were the way that in periods of transition in our lives, or periods of isolation and being stagnant, and not just in the broader scope of living through this time period, but as a creator, as a writer, as an artist, I think when we branch out of our comfort zone, it's what allows us to continue doing work, especially when we feel stuck, or especially when we're caught in a pattern. And maybe that brings up the ideas of how, the silver linings of living through that really tumultuous time where, it feels like things are falling apart. There's the opportunity to create new things and try new things, because we're breaking out of constraints that we've been, for some of us raised in, that are finally breaking apart. I mean, for me, the pandemic was the end of 8 years of working in the service industry straight. And that completely changed my life, because I was miserable before the pandemic. And for me, it was, as horrible as it was, people I love died. It was still an opportunity for growth. And I still don't know what Marcus Aurelius, I mean, I except for what I've read in here, you think there's something about growth in there, or it's something people can reference?
Well, yes. I mean, Marcus Aurelius is a big fan of change. Yeah, like a lot of it is like, don't be afraid of change. Everything is born from change. That one's on my bathroom mirror. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think change and perspective maybe are the two. And one thing I was kind of surprised to find in there too, because I think we think of stoicism and we think of like it's about like controlling your emotions and like not feeling anything and not being emotive, but a lot of it was like people were like exist to work together, and like we exist for each other, which was something I think was kind of brought to the forefront of the pandemic, where it was like we were totally gutted by our inability to care for each other, or we were, seeing like beautiful examples of people caring for each other. But it's interesting too to talk about like that time, like breaking patterns and like breaking out. And I started this as a side project to step away from something that was kind of stagnated because of the pandemic. It was like some project I was doing where I couldn't really move forward with it. And yeah, and I thought it was just gonna be like a fun exercise I was gonna do, and then it was, you know, so much more. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Can we, I think we could move into a reading from Flat Pack.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Okay. All right. I'll do something funny. I actually brought some of the original collages. So I'm gonna pass them around so you can kind of just pass a couple down and then hold a couple for yourself. Okay. Oh yeah.
Water?
Oh yeah, it's right there. Sorry. Thank you. No, don't be sorry. That's why it's there. Okay, so in those you can kind of see how they were literally cut and glued together. And I used a swivel blade X-Acto knife, which will, if you do anything like remotely artistic at all, you should get a swivel blade X-Acto knife because it will change your life.
I don't have one. I use a ceramic blade cutter.
Well, maybe is it nice to like get the
Well,
ceramic blade?
X-Acto's the tip always breaks off for me, but
Yeah.
maybe I pressed too hard.
Yeah, I should have brought you a swivel blade. All right, so I'm going to start with the epigraph. Early on in the crisis, I picked up Marcus Aurelius and for the first time in my life read his meditations, not as an academic exercise, nor in the pursuit of pleasure, but with the same attitude I bring to the instructions for a flat pack table. I was in need of practical assistance. Zadie Smith Intimations. Consider how clear the cut, how close the kinship, how boundless the panic and the abyss, and how the solid body sang, I have seen this often before. This apologetic death is nothing new. Wherever you look, almost everything appears to pour through a narrow opening. When and if it comes, let it happen, if it can. Yes, you can do it. You can. You can return to your remembered body, sober and half-eaten. Another morning, like a river, already forgotten, and a new body, shitting, gripped by anger, and all we have is a stimulus, and an infinity of plants, and a gulf of isolation. My only fear is doing anything, and the wind blows. You could feel the sweetness, the evenness, the pale colors applauding back. This is the sort of life you are always attached to because it is good, but now the dreams make new things through eternal mutations. Who is this self? What a world it is that you belong to. We were born to be overwhelmed, toiling and carrying a corpse, and it carries us. There is nothing, no certainty, no greater grief. On the river, among what remains of summer, the unwashed and unphilosophic glory, people are wrestling with the fear of a larger plan, the fear that everything was born to forgive. First tragedies, then warfare, and above all, the body. In the end, they are loved by it, and it doesn't hurt. This poem is circular, so I'm just gonna pick a random spot to start, but it can start and end at any point. And hopefully you get through the whole thing. But when we idea of wanting to feel affection for people, to become a new person, a different kind of failure burst open as if you've lost control, as if your blood in a bag, as if the ever closer approach of freedom and sanity was greater than any handful of epithets. But that's what we're talking about here, the idea of wanting to feel affection for people, to become a new person. Begin with the warmth of your body's body. the silent shuttle standing there half naked, the teeth, the breath, the carapace, the criticism. This too is like parting. Do not resist pain, the thing itself. How many have died, and how many pried away from life in a single motion. Whoever buries you might say, why pray? They cannot bear the gentleness and the way you bled affections of the flesh. Have you ever seen the work of man, the presence or absence of place, space, desire, brighter than this bearable soul and your ability to bear it? At any rate, pray that you wake up resolute and yielding in such a ridiculous body with strength, sinew, and sadness, and pray that you're still waiting here in the seething waters. You will make mistakes, and even when you ripen and fall, do not dwell on these agonies, but imagine for a brief and fleeting moment all sorts of oblivion, of universal dissolution, of outright beauty, and imagine that the rhythm of tolerance is a kind of community and that you belong to it. Is the aim of this sort of poetry to regraft after tragedy? If so, imagine being suddenly whole, continually lifted up, saved. What is pain? It might be a procession, the empty pomp of the sun pouring itself down amid all this, and the light of a timely end. I was reading, I thought I should clarify that I like, when my process was like, I would take out a couple pages randomly from a couple different translations, and then I would just cut out like individual words that struck me or phrases, mix them all up, and then over a couple days in between teaching and working, like when I walked by my desk, I would arrange them and in different formations, and then I would put a piece of plexiglass over it to save. I got that for another project where I was making time-lapse videos of snails eating cabbage. If anyone wants to see, they're really cool. That's why I had the plexiglass, but then it turned out to be really much better for holding down collage drafts. So I would put that on top, or I'd put them in like a little box or something, and then I would usually the revision process was mostly just taking things away, and I had a kind of a rule for myself based off of what I had observed on other people's erasures, that I tried not to do more than 5 words consecutively. I tried to break that up. And I got to a point, I think one time I lost 1 word and I cheated and I printed it because it was like, I was so perfect, but that was at the end. And for earlier drafts, like there are poems that are not in this book because I sighed too heavily and they just went away, and I was like calling around looking for them, and then I'm like, this is just part of the process. It wasn't meant to be. So
sounds kind of like something the professor you mentioned earlier would consider a finished product.
Yeah.
The sigh that blew the poem away is the work.
It's the work.
Yeah,
That is the work.
So let's talk a little bit more about process, actually. And I want to hear from you as well, Karl, about sort of the different processes that you go through. You just mentioned the plexiglass for the snail stop motion time lapse, and I am going to go watch that later because it sounds amazing.
I'll put it on my Twitter.
Perfect. But what are some other processes each of you have explored in your work, either writing or you meant, like we talked a little bit about this collage, just kind of what jumps out at you as like the way that you work?
The way that you work. I mean, what you were describing, assembling chosen words That's familiar to me in my process of the last year. I wish I brought more relevant examples from that specifically, but a lot of them are still works in progress, of flipping through the source material and finding phrases that jumped out. You know, there were these yearbooks and there were quotes from these students that really jumped out at me, and I was literally cutting words out of the books. Is that weird? You're taking the leaves out of the book and then carefully cutting the, it's kind of weird that we were doing that same thing. For me, it was a really, it's somewhere between being frantic and meditative process, where at times I was like, oh, this is almost perfect. Like, I need to find just the thing to complete this. And other times where I was almost out of myself, just like doing the like automatic painting or drawing, they call it sometimes, where you're just allowing the words to come together themselves, and you barely feel present, but you're making work. You're making something original out of disparate parts. Did you source like a couple of old versions of these texts and cut them up, or
Well, I did. I wish I had put more thought into the translations I used. I did like 2 fairly popular ones, and then one that I kind of randomly found on Amazon. And now I'm like working on, probably gonna keep making more, and using like older translations that I use. So that's where I kind of got them. And it's interesting to hear you talk about like between frantic and sometimes automatic and sometimes meditative, and like some of the small, like cutting out like these screws, like that's meditative. That's like really meditative. But and then I realized, like, when I write prose, it's the kind of thing where like most of it is written in my head before, like I'm thinking about it and taking a note in my phone. But for this, it was hard for me to, and maybe this is why it really worked so well for a time when I was spending so much time in my studio, which is really my room, which is a cross studio because it's professionals. But because I had to physically be there to make it. I couldn't really, like, maybe some of the images, there were some that I started to have ideas, like this one I kind of had the idea and I was like writing down notes, but some of them, like this one, there's no way I could have like imagined that, like I had to physically make that. So and that's really different from what I normally do. Where I'm like thinking and thinking and thinking, because actually when I picture myself writing, like I don't know what I'm picturing. I can't even tell you where I write. It's mostly in bed actually, but when most of it's happening internally, and this was so different because it was like I had to be engaging with the materials in order to do that.
When I was telling you before we met about rereading Art and Fear, trying to connect this idea. Something about, having these source materials that you're assembling rather than generating by yourself. Already, I need to be taking notes for this, but it's my first time doing a panel.
You're doing great.
But the way that I'm already losing the thought. Piecing things together like that is a way of taking us out of our processes that we are accustomed to. And the pandemic, as awful as it's been, presented certain opportunities to us where maybe we're like what other point in our lives will we sit down and be cutting text from books? And you and I both did that. Probably other people were doing that. It's kind of a wacky thing to do where, I was accustomed to working all the time and burning off steam all the time before the pandemic. And then I just had this opportunity to fill my time and be in completely different space. And yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is that generates new ideas, and the only way new ideas and new art can be assembled is for people to be put in situations that are outside of their comfort zone sometimes. Yeah. It doesn't have to be that drastic, but
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a pandemic.
of course, yeah.
And it's interesting, like hearing you say that, I think about how like Intimations, the essay that's referenced in the epigraph, it Zadie Smith began writing it in March and it was published in September, which like you can do when you're Zadie Smith, but it's like a very, very pandemic essay collection. So, you know, if we hadn't had the pandemic, she would not have written that, and I would not have written this. So it's like doubly yeah.
What was going on in the time period that Marcus Aurelius was written?
That's a good question. I actually don't feel confident answering that.
Okay.
Yeah,
I would have Googled it if I
yeah. No, I don't.
I'm sure there was an upheaval happening,
Yeah.
even if it's just like you're talking about Kafka, a workers' upheaval,
Yeah.
a labor movement.
That's a really good question, because I've always kind of seen it as like a personal, I mean, there are lots of different branches of philosophy that were like developing at the time. And I've read a little bit about like where this one came from and how they diverged, and yeah, but I didn't actually really consider extensively like what in his life would, which is kind of surprising. I probably should have.
Well, the flat pack images themselves are very specific to this point in time. I mean, I had to Google that before I came out here. I was like, that makes me think of IKEA, but I'm not sure that's what that is.
Yeah, no, it is all IKEA.
Essentially, it is what you might imagine. Yeah, it's instructional, but it's supposed to be universal. It's without language.
Yeah. And there are I've read interviews with people who designed the manuals, and they say that that's really intentional. Like they don't want any language because they don't want to have to deal with translation. But there also are, if you look really carefully at these figures, which I wrote about in my tri-quarterly essays, that they do have like little cues for their, like some of them have wedding rings.
They have a gender, they have a marital status. Yeah. They still have cultural markers that maybe the creator wasn't even conscious of. But I think you'd have to be conscious of it to put a wedding ring on a flat pack image.
I think you would. And it makes me wonder, like, what are they trying to say?
Maybe it's someone's way of leaving a personal touch on a commissioned work that's so depersonalized for so many people creating it. Like, I get to put no part of myself into this art, but I can pretend that this character is my wife and relate to it better that way by putting a ring on. I don't know.
Yeah. That's sweet. That's a much nicer reading than I had.
It's like
they're trying to enforce. It's like, before you put together this table, make sure you're not living in sin.
Yeah, this is not a single person's table.
Yeah,
this is a married
single person's table. Not even someone for people who are dating. Yeah. And also people have mentioned, and I didn't really think about, I have noticed that the people look sad. If you look at them totally decontextualized, there's that woman, she's kind of happy, but a lot of them just look devastated. It's gotta put together another table. And in some of the images, it looks like they're helping each other. And then in some of them, it's almost like maybe they're adversaries. And then on this one, Are We Forever Undone, I kind of tried to make it a little homoerotic. Maybe there's something happening there that is a little more exciting than putting together a desk. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
I just had another thought pop up that's getting past me. Oh God, I wanted to address it, but I can't remember what it is. Are we nearing time? I don't know.
Yeah. While you're getting back to your thought,
Yeah.
something that I want to ask before we start kind of getting into the Q&A session too is, what are some works of art or writing that have, aside from intimations, that have kind of popped up during the pandemic, that have had an impact on you or have struck you in some way, whether or not it's about the experience of being in the pandemic, but just things that have come out and that were created during this time? And if there are some things like that, what did you notice that perhaps there was some difference in the work that could be perceived, if that makes sense?
Mhm. I remembered the thing that I wanted to talk about, that it was that the pandemic is causing some of us to move past focus on like hyper individualism and build community,
Yeah.
which I think you mentioned, and which I think is another thing that the flat pack images form a connection to, that there's some things that are possible to assemble alone. And we, late stage capitalism or techno feudalism or whatever people call the current time period that we're living in, we're reaching that breaking point where society tells you that you can do it alone, you should be able to do it alone, but look at us, like we absolutely can't. And that's something that I can read into those images as well.
Yeah. That's a very nice reading, actually. Yeah, I could see that. Yeah.
And that's like Shay's talking about, that's the type of media that's resonated with me most, where I see media coming out not about dystopia, but about people coming together, which I mean sometimes happens in dystopian fiction, but I think things have been so cynical and pessimistic that like open people and wanting to collaborate. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like that's interesting. I don't know what inspired. I think what I've been reading during the pandemic has been a lot of like really straightforward nonfiction or fiction that's very straightforward, like Lydia Davis wrote this book where she's literally, it's the whole book, it's a story, it's like a memoir of her looking at her window at a house, and like every day she just describes, have you read it? Yeah. And why am I enjoying this so much? And it's beautiful, and it's not like embellished at all, it's just like Cow Diary. And I read that, and then I read Jenny Ophil's Weather. And that was pretty straightforward too. Like I was like, wow, sometimes a sentence can literally just be a sentence that just says something and gets you from one place to another, which was really and Ben Lerner and Z Smith, and then also a chapbook that came out from Split Lit Press by an author named Calvin Walds, who I taught some of it to my students. And that is a little more of like memoir that engages with outside texts. So actually not a lot of experimental poetry, aside from Sloat, who I mentioned, and I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. I'd like to go ahead and move into our Q&A portion, but I'm going to start with a question from our live stream here. From Anger Monsoon is the name of the user. They say, Annie, would you talk more about how some of the images specifically got paired with the specific texts? Like, did the image suggest the text or the inverse?
Okay, that's a good question. So I don't really, yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like it just sort of happened. So I would just have my desk, which is at the time it was 3 desks from IKEA pushed together. And I would have like pieces of like image here and some text here. And I don't know. Yeah, actually, I'm thinking back, like so much of it was documented, of course, like through my phone camera. And there were times when I would have that I would like have, I've looked back and saw like, oh my God, I used to have these words with these images, but I don't know why I changed it. And I don't think I ever tried to illustrate. Yeah, I don't think meant to illustrate, I don't think the images were actually meant to illustrate what was happening in the text. I think it was more about the shape. So like the second to last one, it was nice to have something falling because it was like an ending. And some of them like were cyclical, so I wanted cyclical images. Some of them are like really bodily, so I wanted to make sure there were people in it, or people featured prominently. And then some of them had like a certain like balance and serenity. But a lot of it, to be perfectly honest, a lot of it was just like the poem got made at the same time as the image, that they just happened at the same time.
Cool.
Good question.
Awesome. We can open up to the floor for any more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about your process with the cover.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the cover is a risograph. And a risograph is a printing machine that prints one color at a time. So I had one sheet that was the tables, called them chaos tables, one sheet that was the screws, and one sheet that was the bolts, or the nuts, and they were, and then I had charcoal to try to make this gradient. And Jen here helped me, and she doesn't want to take any credit, but I would really not be able to have done it without her help, and at the George Mason Print Studio. So we did a couple, we went out there and we did like 2 sessions. And the first one, I had this like really clear idea, and then it was like, oh, that's not gonna work. And so we came back and we did this one. Yeah, and I actually brought some of the original Riso prints with me if anyone wants one.
Cool. Any other questions?
Can we see the Riso print?
Yeah.
Maybe show it on camera.
Yeah, I brought a whole bunch of stuff.
Sign.
Oh, I also brought some photocopied cabbage from the snail.
Yeah. Oh, those
Okay.
look awesome.
Yeah, so this is one of the actual poems. And then, let's see, I have some more of those. Yeah, because first we were trying for primary colors because IKEA is primary. But then we decided to have this like really beautiful fuchsia. You can see. This is what it looks like.
That's fabulous. Did you have a color version of the book made, or like on file for another day to print a full color version? Or
Well, not really. We've talked about it. Maybe like doing a limited edition Riso. So keep your eyes open. It might, and like maybe this summer actually, because it's a lot of fun. It's like a lot of fun to work with. Although I did like, one thing I really liked about this, like when I first made it, I was like, oh, this works. Like it's black and white, like it's
yeah, so it is kind of like, I think a lot of the like ethos of the book is that it is black and white. So yeah, so I don't feel like so much. I mean, I like it how it is, and I'm excited to experiment.
Yeah.
And maybe like with the color too, I think you can have more layer and like more chaos.
They both definitely have their merits, and you print in color and it could be a huge price jump for people and you can't reach as many people. So I fully get that. I think anyone who's printed a zine is familiar with that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But also it's really beautiful. And
You had a question over here?
This isn't so much a question as a prompt for reflection, but I'm a biographer and I'm aware that you both talked in process and stuff, but you also, it's striking that you're working in a time of isolation and both in conversation with people. So with your grandmother's yearbooks, with the Zadie Smith, the response to that, but also Aurelius' words. And I just wonder if you could reflect on that and talk about what that was like, or if you felt like you were building, if there was community building going on through that process. Both reached for these other people's stuff.
yeah.
And I'm just curious to hear more about that.
It's a great question. Yeah. So I definitely felt more in touch with Smith than Aurelius. And in a sense, when I was reading his work, I was really trying to embody what I understood, my interpretation of Smith's first reading as described in her introduction. So I was really I was reading it chaotically and out of order. And not that she read it out of order, but she read it during a time when everything was topsy-turvy. So I was kind of trying to embody that. And because of that, I think I was less concerned with who he was as a person. Which is, and that is something now, like a whole year later, I'm like, okay, I should really, I'm starting to feel more curious. I'm like, I should know really more about this person. Yeah, but I don't know if I so much connected with, that is a really good question. It is a really good question too, because it's hard, like so much of the context in Aurelius, and actually I just started recently reading like more like historians writing about him, and I'm starting to be able to see like, oh, okay, I can start to imagine like what this person's life was like. But the book is like such different context on just like everyday things, so that like spiritually on like a philosophical level, some of it you can connect with, and then every now and then, and I can't think of a specific example, but it's like I have no idea what to do with that, Yeah, but I think it was yeah, and maybe trying to feel that connection with like all the people who are feeling this adriftness at the beginning of the pandemic. And I really was thinking like March and April 2020, like this, just like, what the heck do we do? Where do we go from here? Yeah. And I felt connected with the people, like I would send little photos to my family and be like, and my brother, who's like very mechanical, would be like, I'll move that plank to the left. So that was nice. Yeah. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I'm really curious about.
I'm thinking about how community building applies throughout space and time continuum. Like if I'm connecting with my grandmother after death, and that's doing what I was doing, was just my way of having more time with her when I couldn't see her in the hospital, or like, for a while leading up to that. And it's kind of like, I'm sure other people in this time are connecting with, and I don't know, anyone who's lost someone, hopefully, some people, obviously not, it's a great privilege to be able to grieve properly. But I feel like in this pandemic, I was able to grieve the way I wanted to grieve, because for once in my life, I didn't have to go physically be at work and keep up with I was in rural Virginia at my grandmother's home by myself, but I didn't feel alone at all. I felt very connected to her, and for that was healing for me. I don't know.
Is that where you were making the collages?
Yeah. So to me, it's like even when we're deep in isolation, we can still be connecting, we can still be building or forming the tools to better connect with people. Sometimes that's what we're teaching ourselves in isolation.
I think that's a really great note to end on. Thank you both so much again. This has been amazing. We have some time for you all to chat and stick around. Make sure to return your the things that were passed around earlier.
Oh,
So we can put them
yeah.
back into the folder. I know that Karl has some of their art for sale to take home as well, if you want to.
Yeah, if anyone wants to browse through, I have this rack of stuff. Sorry, excuse me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, you guys want prints?
Do you have multiples of this one? You just snag some.
Do you have multiples of this one? Or
Yeah.
Two.
Everything?
Oh,
Oh, one.
I'm so sorry. I just didn't want to take your
Do
only
you
one.
want multiple?
Well, thanks for coming out today.
Yeah.